Permanent resident status in Canada comes with an ongoing residency obligation. This obligation applies to all permanent residents, regardless of how or when permanent resident status was obtained. The residency obligation is set out in Section 28 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It requires a permanent resident to demonstrate compliance over each rolling 5-year period. At its core, the residency obligation is a time-based requirement. A permanent resident must accumulate at least 730 days of qualifying presence within a 5-year period. These days do not need to be consecutive. The most straightforward way to meet the residency obligation is through physical presence in Canada. Any day or part of a day spent physically in Canada counts as one full day toward the 730-day requirement. However, physical presence is not the only way days can count. The legislation also allows certain days spent outside Canada to be treated as days in Canada, provided specific conditions are met. One situation involves accompanying a Canadian citizen spouse or common law partner outside Canada. Each day a permanent resident is outside Canada, while ordinarily residing with a Canadian citizen spouse or partner may be counted as a day toward the residency obligation. Another situation involves employment outside Canada. A permanent resident may count days spent outside Canada if they are employed on a full-time basis by a qualifying Canadian business or by the Public Service of Canada or a province, and the overseas assignment meets the regulatory requirements. A third situation involves accompanying a permanent resident spouse or partner outside Canada, where that spouse or partner is employed full-time by a qualifying Canadian business or public institution and is themselves in compliance with the residency obligation. These categories are defined narrowly. Not all time spent outside Canada qualifies. The burden rests on the permanent resident to demonstrate that the conditions are met and that the days should be counted. The residency obligation is assessed on a rolling basis. This means that compliance is determined by looking back at the 5-year period immediately preceding the assessment date. There is no fixed anniversary review. The relevant 5-year window depends on when the assessment takes place. For permanent residents who have held status for less than 5 years, the assessment is forward-looking. In those cases, the question is whether the person can still meet the 730-day requirement by the end of the initial 5-year period. It is important to understand that intent to live in Canada is not sufficient. The residency obligation is based on days and qualifying categories, not future plans or general ties to Canada. Establishment, family connections, or property ownership do not replace the requirement to meet the residency obligation. The residency obligation is not automatically assessed every year. It is typically examined when a permanent resident applies for a permanent resident card, a permanent resident travel document, seeks to enter Canada after time abroad, or otherwise comes to the attention of immigration authorities. Failing to meet the residency obligation does not automatically result in loss of permanent resident status. A determination must be made under the Act, and procedural steps follow. However, once a negative determination becomes final, permanent resident status can be lost. In some cases, humanitarian and compassionate considerations may be raised in relation to a residency obligation determination. These considerations do not replace the residency obligation. They are assessed only after a shortfall has been identified and are applied on a case-by-case basis. The residency obligation is the permanent resident's responsibility. It is not monitored automatically, and there is no advance warning when compliance is at risk. Keeping track of days and understanding which periods may qualify is essential. In summary, the permanent resident residency obligation requires at least 730 qualifying days in each rolling 5-year period. Physical presence in Canada is the primary way to meet this requirement, but limited time outside Canada may also count if specific conditions are satisfied. Compliance is assessed based on evidence, not intention. Understanding the residency obligation is critical because it affects travel, documentation, and ultimately the ability to retain permanent resident status.